Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Medicine for These Times. I am so honored to be speaking with Rosemary Gladstar here. Hi, Rosemary. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Beth.
I said I feel like you're like one of the herbal celebrities to me. It's like, wow. You've published so many amazing books. I've been following your work for so long. I've had a lot of clients who've actually studied under you, friends that are herbalists. I can go on and on. And I think, it's also we're kind of in the similar region of the United States, and the word gets around. Everybody knows all the great herbalists on, at least on the East Coast. So good to have you here. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
The first question I always love to open with is, how did you get onto this career path? The path of making this your livelihood, your vocation, your business. And did you ever imagine being here? And like, did you ever do anything totally different when you were, younger or
I always say I'm one of
like a
the lucky
lawyer?
ones. I sort of found my path really early in life. I grew up on a small dairy farm in Northern California, actually, and I was just surrounded by plants. And also, I was really fortunate. Both of my grandmothers, both of my grandparents lived very close to us. But my Armenian grandmother on my mother's side, she was a really good herbalist. She just knew the plants, and she used all the plants for healing. And a lot of it was because she was at a time when grandparents knew a lot about plants, especially of my generation. And yeah, and she also was a survivor of the Armenian genocide. And she used to tell us that it was her knowledge of plants and her great faith in God. She was deeply religious that saved her life. She meant it literally, actually. So she just, I think, felt it was part of her religious duty to teach us about the plants that grew up around us. And I wasn't signaled out. I'd love to say, I was noticed as this special child, but I was just one of a whole herd of children. It's just that I did have a special affinity with the plants and, just kind of felt them in my soul my whole life. And I think I very young followed that path. Like I remember in the 7th and 8th grade, my science projects were on the edible uses and the native uses of plants of Sonoma County. I still have those plant books, by the way. And yeah. And as far as it being a career, but I'm back in the 1970s when I first entered into the adult world, herbalism was not a career. I mean, it was definitely, if you told people that you were studying herbs, they would look at you very strangely and move on to talk to somebody else. It definitely was not the in thing to be, but it was part of the whole back to the earth movement, like of the hippie generation, of which I'm certainly one. And so in that way, I think I was kind of just following naturally a path that had been laid out for me. Yeah, I really feel like so many people, I'm sure you feel this too, that it was more a calling than a career. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I'd love to hear about that. It is very few people that are just know at such a young age and then just follow it. Especially being kind of a pioneer, like you just said, it was not a thing back then. And I'm curious, did you ever go through the questioning of like, what am I really doing? How am I gonna be able to pay the bills? And is this a thing? Because these days, I do business coaching, and I hear this all the time, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I never questioned my career because, as I said, I never really thought of it as a career. I always just thought of it as a way of life, what I was meant to do with my life. I felt that very strongly. So that part I never questioned. As far as how to pay the bills, I think I questioned that most of my life. Yeah, growing up on a dairy farm, the daughter of small farmers, there was always the issue of how you were going to pay your bills if you even were. So I grew up knowing what it was like to be very poor, very rich in spirit, and rich in the sense that we had really good food, like lots of fresh raw milk and food from the garden, but definitely really poor as far as being able to afford things of the world. So I don't think it worried me as much as it might have worried other people. It's just sort of the state of my life for most of my life. And also, I came into being an adult in the 1970s. That's when I entered my 20s. And it was the whole hippie thing. So the whole hippie movement, there was some bad in that movement, but most of it was really good. The whole back to the earth, the ecology, the whole foods, the wanting to get back to natural kind of living, all of that was really good. And also it was rejecting, buying houses and having cars and stuff. So I felt kind of lucky in that way, that pressure was not bearing down on me. Like we lived in a house that we probably paid $100 a month for, and I rented a space in a natural food store where I started my first herb store. Everything traditional medicinals, the tea company that I co-founded with my partner at that time, Drake Sadler. I mean, we just started it in our attic. I mean, I don't even think I had $50 to start it with. I had made teas in the store and sold those to my customers, and then we put them in bags, So that part of it was never much of a, my parents worried much more about me than I did in that manner. I remember I think at one time when I was still in my 20s and running the herb store and just started herb conferences and retreats and stuff, my dad was saying to me, like, you're going to have to think about getting a real job, Rosie, because I had a little boy at that time as well. How are you going to be able to afford anything? And I'm looking at him thinking, I'm doing just fine, Dad. So it was kind of an attitude, the time I was living in. I wish we lived more in those kind of times where people were so much less concerned with the gathering of material things. I've become that way. I worry about it now more than I ever did in my life. I'm in my late 70s now. But, that's what happens when you acquire things. Then you have to be responsible for them. At that time, I had my thumb. I hitchhiked everywhere. I lived in a little cottage on the hillside that really cost us nothing, It was pretty good times.
I know. I'm like, that sounds so nice.
Yeah, it was.
I think so many of us are kind of secretly hoping it just goes back that way. There's so many people like, oh, it's all just gonna crash down. And I'm like, well, maybe it's for the best, maybe we'll just really be forced to get back onto the earth. I don't know, who knows what's gonna happen or how it's gonna happen or what it takes. But so let's hear about, in case people don't know about you and your beautiful work, what have you been up to since then? You just started kind of giving people herbs and making teas and teaching people how to use them, and then some books along the way. And yeah, tell me a little bit about your business now.
Well, the primary thing I think I focused on in my life, I have run a number of very successful businesses, but my main focus has been on education of really, I would say it's been my lifelong vision actually, and mission is to help people bring herbalism back into their home and into their heart, and to teach it as a way of life, not just as a system of medicine, because that's only a very small part of what herbalism is, and also as a very economical and ecological system of medicine, probably the most ecological system and economical system in the world. So for many, many years, I ran herbal centers in schools. I've always had a home study course, so I've taught thousands and thousands of students around the world on that. And I've written books. One of my favorite things that I did was travel adventures. They're called plant lovers journeys. I went to 28 countries with groups of people, leading them and studying medicinal plants with indigenous people and different cultures. It was really fun. That was the hardest thing for me to kind of put aside. I love those travel. I'm still traveling, but mostly by myself and my girlfriends or my husband. So I just have done, like most herbalists, it's not just one focus. I had started a few companies that grew quite big, but I never really liked running businesses. I really love the educational aspect of it. I think the thing that I would say that I've done that in the herbal world that I'm most proud of is, the educational work of really making herbalism accessible to housewives and house husbands and children, and also the work of United Plant Savers. That was another organization I founded in 1994. It's been I think we're celebrating our 35th anniversary or 30th this year. And it was an organization that was primarily concerned with the status of native at-risk plants, like how is golden seal and ginseng and bloodroot and black cohosh and echinacea and all these golden seal, all these herbs that are used in massive amounts in the herb industry and pharmaceutical industry as well. How are they doing in their native habitats? Nobody was really looking at that from an herbalist user and manufacturing perspective. So the United Plant Savers really became a voice for the plants. And has done incredibly well. It's a national organization now that's actually created an international model for medicinal plant conservation. Yeah.
So good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing and all this amazing work. And I love how you just said it, a voice for the plants. You know, I was saying to you a little off camera before we started. I've noticed over the years, and I kind of wonder if maybe it's just the bubble I live in of other plant lovers, but it seems to be that herbalism has taken off so much that it's kind of becoming not only mainstream, but it's like, I mean, again, maybe it's just me and all my friends. It's just the norm. Like it's the standard. It's like, I go to a friend's house and you're always offered nettle tea. It's like, who doesn't have nettles? Oh, what do you mean you don't have nettles at home? Like who doesn't have, you know, but it's, and I keep making jokes about, I'm like, soon we're going to see nettle as the new, like, Coca-Cola type drink, you know, like some kind of drink on the shelf. I mean, seriously. But what do you think happened in the consciousness, at least here in the United States, coming from this perspective? Or am I just making this up because I'm in a bubble full of other plant lovers?
No, absolutely. Herbalism has become much more accepted. There's no doubt about it. Um, if you go back in my lifetime, if I go back 50 years, back to the 1970s, really hardly, it was very alternative. Doctors that I remember when I first started doing classes in the local hospitals, it was like they just were so leery of it. And now it's very common. And, doctors are interested at least. And, most of the time they know enough when patients come in, they always ask, are you taking herbs and supplements, right? That's a common question now. They may not know what they're taking, but at least they want to know if they are. So, and you pick up any magazine, newspaper, especially women's magazines, there's always going to be sometimes on the front page, medicinal herbs for this and that. So it's really becoming much more mainstream. On one hand, I'm really glad to see that, it is everyday people's medicine. That's really been the power of herbalism since the beginning of time. It was something that people did use in their homes and used them as food and as medicine and for all the common ailments. Nobody ran to a doctor for colds and coughs and even flus unless they were terrible. So I'm really happy to see that. As I mentioned this earlier, it's such an ecologically sane medicine and economically sane. It's both of those things. It can be really free for people. Many more clinics, especially the low-cost clinics, they could teach people how to make echinacea tinctures and, even things how to ward off viruses, etc. So all of that is beautiful to see, and it's happening slowly, that aspect of it. It also engenders an entirely unique set of problems, right? Because so many people, because their training is with allopathic medicine, our modern system of healing, they want to superimpose that system over herbalism, and they're entirely different systems. You can't really layer them on top of each other. They're really, really different systems of healing. And so when people try to approach herbalism like they do allopathic medicine, it often doesn't work. And also there's a huge responsibility in using both. Using allopathic medicine, it would be great if people assumed a lot more responsibility and didn't lay it all on their poor doctors who really don't know their individual bodies, as much as they study. They don't know the constitutional type of the person or what caused their harm, what caused this disease or illness. They do very quick intakes. Oftentimes they spend 5 minutes reading those intakes. They're just overworked and overbusy. They don't really have the time. So, yeah, so people come to herbal medicine. Like I was starting to say, people need to take more responsibility in their medical allopathic field as well, but definitely in herbalism. There's an enormous responsibility because you need to know the herbs you're using. Also, there's a sustainability aspect to it. You need to be responsible for the medicine you're using. When you're using that medicine, are you depleting it from the natural resources or from the native people who might depend on it entirely? So there's a much bigger picture that comes with using herbal medicine. And that often isn't being taught, unfortunately. I mean, all good herbalists, I know in the school that you went to, and all good herbal schools and all good herbalists will always teach environmental factors, lifestyle issues, all of that. But when you look at what's available on the web and also in some of the books that are being, thrown out by publishers, they're irresponsible, quite honestly. So Am I excited? Yes, it's beautiful to see that people have this opportunity to learn herbs because they are a people's medicine and always have been. It can be affordable medicine form, can be very safe medicine. It's really joyful to learn. So there's that aspect. So much in life today seems joyless. So many people's lives are stressed and joyless. And people who study plants, even when they have a lot of stress and grief and whatever, there's always a sense of joy because the plants just fill people up with joy the more you work with them. So I'm happy to see it, but I also am concerned about. Plus, I enjoyed it. Personally, I really liked it when I was an oddball. When you tell people you worked with herbs and they looked at you like you were crazy. Now, when you tell them you work with herbs, they start telling you all their personal, private health problems, things that you don't always really want to hear about, right? So there was a part of me that sort of liked being on the edge or being a pioneer. I'm just joking with that, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. This whole podcast has people working on the edge. It's people in the psychedelic field and people working in death and tantra and everything.
Yes.
So we love it. But I'm curious when you speak about ecological. I mean, it's interesting. There's a lot of listeners that are also into various plant medicines and work with, let's say, psilocybin or ayahuasca and these plants that are some plants that maybe are traditionally only found in other parts of the world and have kind of spread out and somehow made it all over the world. So they would probably be interested in hearing about this. You mentioned, depleting plants or leaving enough for the native peoples. Yeah, is there another aspect of the ecological part of it that we should know about that's important to understand? Or is it more just being in the right balance with your local environment? And,
Well, I think it's definitely, especially when we're using any sacred plant. All plants are sacred, but there are some that are really the powerful medicine, that allow people to travel to the spirits and commune directly with God. And those plants were always used ceremoniously. And unfortunately, so many Americans and not just Americans, but modern cultures have forgotten about walking sacredly on the earth. They're words, but they don't really know how to connect their feet, right? And so these plants can be great teachers, and these old shamans, usually they're elderly people, can be great teachers, but we have so little reference to it that oftentimes it's very shallow how it's received, unfortunately. So much so that, things like here's a really simple example, and so I can drop it deeper, but it's like using white sage. You see it's on TV, people smudge things with white sage, or you can go into any kind of little gifty shop and you see the white sage. And yet white sage is a highly endangered plant now. It used to grow prolifically, but because of the demand by the modern culture who doesn't really understand the sacredness of that plant, how it used to be harvested, the people would go out at special times, the indigenous cultures who caretook their wild stands, caretook the wild gardens, oftentimes for generations, not just like, here I am, 20 years old, and I'm learning how to smudge with white sage. And so, unfortunately, it's been heavily poached, like people going onto parkland or native land. And so, without any understanding of that, and we're just talking about white sage, but when you start to talk about herbs like peyote and ayahuasca, those have a long history of a spiritual nature. They were like the spiritual plants of these cultures for generations. We don't even know how far back in time. And yeah, ayahuasca, which is several plants all put together, all of them coming from the rainforest, with the demand that it is, it's very threatening to the native stands of it. And yeah, it's something that I think every one of us who loves plants and loves this earth and wants to have that spiritual relationship with plants and all life, we really need to be very thoughtful about that. On a simple level, I say even something like echinacea, such a wonderful everyday herb now. People don't use it every day, but it's well known, by a big culture. It's at risk in the United States. It's native to the North American continent. It's found growing natively nowhere else in the world. And because of poaching and overuse and not sustainable use, all of the native varieties are considered at risk, statistically at risk. That doesn't mean we can't use it, but we have to be using it from cultivated sources, organically cultivated sources, and supporting what I consider another highly endangered species, which is the American farmer, So, yeah, some of the sacred plants you can't grow. I don't know that ayahuasca could be cultivated. People maybe need to just be a lot more thoughtful about their uses. I've sat in ceremony with people, these beautiful young people who are intent on having spiritual, they really want these. And they sit there and they brag that I've had 30 ayahuasca experiences. And I'm just looking at them thinking, it's kind of ridiculous,
Like, why do you need 30?
Why do you need 30? And have you ever thought about the plants that you're consuming for your 30 journeys, or where that plant is coming from and who had to prepare that plant for you? And, it's just, yeah, it's just things we need to think about. I don't mean to place judgment. I just am thinking that there's a huge disconnect. Partly why that is because people in North America are starving for spiritual connection. But quite honestly, there's some incredible work being done on the sacred nature of an herb like nettle, like you mentioned, or the sacred nature of dandelion, of dieting with those plants and using those plants to journey. And those plants are weedy, everyday species that grow near people, so we recognize them and use them. Very, very different than a plant like ayahuasca or peyote or San Pedro or any of those powerful plants. And you can have, if you allow yourself and put yourself in the right place, you can have an amazing spiritual teaching with plants like that. Yeah.
Any plants, all plants.
All plants.
Even no plants, right? Like a vision quest.
That's right.
One of the most powerful experiences I've ever had in my life. Nothing.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, it's come up so much out there, especially as our culture changes and shifts. It's it's a lot of the culture around like consumption and like fast, easy answers. Like I call it the Amazon Prime effect, where it's like everybody just wants to order something and have it delivered the next day, like right in their arms.
I was putting that Amazon Prime with the Amazon, right? It's like,
that too. Oh my God. I don't even think about that. But yes, exactly. Well, out in the psychedelic space for, especially starting around 2020, when there was just, it blew up so fast into the mainstream culture, there was a lot of this like, oh, well, I hear that microdosing will just cure my depression. So then they just go and take it, or like this kind of like quick fix approach. Like, let me see, I heard this will heal this, or I heard that I'll just feel better immediately. And then, the truth is revealed that it's not the case, that there's so much more. It's like, where's the integration? Where's the other support? Where's your relationship with everything, And like you said, there's so many people starving for spiritual connection, or joy, what was the term you used? Like, joyless. Like, it's just, there's like a lot of people out there with this lack of joy. I'm curious, I know the answer to this, but I'm curious your take on it. Why do plants bring us joy? And have you ever met anybody that's genuinely like, no, not into plants, like, I have no joy, don't care? Think they're out there?
maybe. I'm lucky enough to be surrounded mostly by plant lovers by choice. Let's see. Why do plants bring us so much joy? Well, for one thing, I think that they have been inhabiting this earth for zillions of years, and they've adapted to the unadaptable things, like complete climate changes, like areas like we live in here in New England that used to be a glacier. A glacier sat here for 5,000 years, just 10,000 years ago, not very long ago at all. And all the big mountains were just ground down. Every single plant that we have here is entirely different than it would have been just a few years ago, like 10,000 years ago. So they've adapted to, all kinds of change. It's not like, so there's this incredible survival, but they do far more than survive. They thrive, so even in the worst situation, like you look after fire, everything's destroyed. And then what do you get? Next year it rains and they have the most incredible display of wildflowers you could ever imagine. Or like in the desert, like it may not rain for 4 or 5 years and nothing looks like everything is just kind of holding on and barely surviving. And then they get a rain and the desert bursts full of wildflowers and flowers, gorgeous, colorful flowers out of nothing. Just a little sand and a little rain, a little water. So, and then they have learned to adapt to the degree, like I would say, of a very consciously high person, that they not only have enough energy to take care of their own survival, but they have enough to feed others, to provide medicine for others, not just people, but for animals and insects, for everything else that lives, actually. They can eat off of them and they continue to survive and thrive. And then they create such beauty, so it's hard to be around something of such incredibly high consciousness without absorbing. So even if you're not aware of it, like may not even be aware of plants at all, but you walk into an office building that's full of plants and you usually feel uplifted just by the air and the greenery around you. Or if you go into a botanical garden, usually, even if you're really sad, you start to feel better after a little while. Or I always say, you never really see a grumpy gardener unless they're really anal and are trying to get all the weeds out of their garden. Because every gardener, when they walk into their garden, they're like busy doing tasks that they often enjoy, or harvesting or picking bouquets of flowers. And it uplifts the spirit, which is partly why people garden. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the plants themselves have evolved beyond survival to be highly evolved beings that just are able to give out everything. Like they make the air we breathe, they make the clothes we wear, they make the food we eat. It's the base of every food that we eat is the bottom chain is some kind of plant. I mean, the very fact that the air we breathe is a gift from the plants, that's like pretty amazing. And that the out-breath, our carbon, the plants utilize. They breathe that in. So it's a very co-creative partnership, but I would say co-creative in the sense that the plants are far more highly evolved than humans. We depend on them. They don't depend on us. It's more like a parent-child relationship.
Gosh, if we could only just remember that all the time, right? Like we're just the little babies, and maybe we could listen a little bit more to our parents, right? It's interesting you mentioned, the consciousness and the highly evolved beings. And I'm wondering, are there herbalists out there who are completely leaving out the spirit? Like where does the spirit of these plants fit into this conversation in general?
Yeah. Well, so I think there are definitely people who focus more on the spiritual nature. Some totally, like shamans, they do use plants physically for healing, but oftentimes what they're doing is working with the spirit of the plant, calling on that spirit. They have, usually over a long lifetime. I don't know really any young shamans, quite honestly. I know people who have a absolute predisposition to have the spirit in them, but it takes a long time to develop that kind of relationship where they can call on that spirit of the plant to come and do the healing work. I forgot where I was going with that. What was the question
about
again?
The spirit of the plants. Like, do people leave the spirit out? In this world that we're in.
I mean, so there are people. I was answering in the positive. I was starting to say there are people who spend their lifetime studying that, and there's also a lot of plant lovers and herbalists and people who work with plants who study just the chemical constituents, the physical components of the plants. But even that can be very spiritual. So I would say that almost everybody I know who works with plants in one way or another, whether they're very scientific, very left brain, or very right brain and very spiritual, all are digging into this infinite reality of the plants, I would say. I think it's hard to leave that out. You'd have to work hard to leave that out because in some way or the other, the plants are working you. They're grabbing you. So we see that a lot more today with people who are scientists studying plants. We see more books coming out from these scientists, talking really about their discoveries that go far beyond the physicality of the plant. So I just think there is a spiritual component in plants that you can try to leave out, but usually the plants will get you in the end.
That's a really good way to put it. I love it. It's funny because I wanted to ask about this. I'm always curious about where this is all going to go in the future. You know, like I was telling you off camera about my mom with dementia and my stepdad who passed from Alzheimer's. And I know there's more and more research coming out, but it's like every day I wonder, like, what are they working on? Like, what are they studying? And, I mean, I know most of the issue is like, unless there's not money to be made or a patent to be patented by some pharmaceutical company, like maybe they don't even want to study it. But hopefully that's not the case. But yeah, where do you think the cutting edge or the leading edges of herbalism and plants and plant medicine, and where is it going in our maybe the next 10, 20, 30 years? Like, do you think mushrooms will clean up all the oil spills, which, there's more and more of this coming out, mushroom remediation. And then, are plants going to be what helps heal Alzheimer's forever? Like maybe no one will ever get it. We'll just cure it. Do you know about like what is the research that maybe most of us like common folk don't know about out there? Like,
I mean, there is a lot of research both on chemicals and on plant chemicals going on. I don't think it's because of the non-patenting. I mean, I think everybody is unified in wanting to find cures for these horrible illnesses. And we could point fingers at the medical companies, et cetera. But, everybody's been impacted with things by cancer and Alzheimer's and now diabetes and some of these terrible things. And the answer to me is not in the medicine, it's in the lifestyle and food. I really have to say that when we're looking at our modern illnesses, people didn't have them before. They had other things for certain, like terrible accidents, and people died from different things. It wasn't that people didn't have Alzheimer's or they didn't have heart attacks, but it was very rare, or they didn't have cancer. We know people had cancer, but it wasn't a common everyday occurrence. Certainly we didn't see things like autism in children like we do today, which I think is one of the most horrible things, because children and parents and everybody involved, it's usually a lifetime trauma that goes on. So I think it's lifestyle. And I do think plants play a big part in that, of course, because herbs and are food, right? And they're the basis of what people eat, whether they're carnivores or flexivores or vegetarians or whatever kind of wars they are. So I think that we're really when we're looking at what's the solution to those problems, we're really having to reevaluate the toxicity that we've created on this planet in an amazingly short time. Really, we're looking from World War II, from around 1945 to now, right? That we've seen this horrible onslaught of chemicals and herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, and medical is also very responsible for an enormous amount of toxicity that's put into the environment. So that's why I always emphasize, one of the things I love about herbalism, it's very ecological, where modern medicine is not ecological at all. It's maybe helping you or your mother or whatever, our relatives or whatever, but it's really destroying the environment. It's part of a very destructive pattern. And so when we're really looking for those answers for how to create better health, it's not through medicine or even herbal medicine. It's really through lifestyle. And plants can play a big part in that, for certain. I know that's not really answering your question, but I would say that bottom line, we have to really reevaluate lifestyle. I do think there are solutions in the plants. Plants are very helpful as supportive, very, very supportive for people's overall well-being. So like with some of the really serious health problems where people do need to take they need to take medicine because it's a life-threatening situation. Plants can be helpful in situations. Sometimes they can work miracles, but so can modern medicine. I would imagine there's not a reader or listener who hasn't known somebody who's had their life saved from a cardiac experience or, a terrible burn or any of the horrible things where medicine hasn't stepped in and really helped. But herbs can always play a part in supporting that. And occasionally they can save lives as well in the same way. But oftentimes for those heroic types of situations, that's where allopathic medicine, it was designed for the battlefield, right? That's what we always say about modern medicine. It was really, really powerful when there's horrible accidents, and and plants can play a role in that, but usually are not able to step in and just fix what the issue is. Am I making sense?
Yeah, yeah, very much. Thank you so much. Um, it's interesting because I had this experience about a year and a half ago where, of course, the doctors were trying to give my mom lots of different drugs. And I'm like, but, why? Like, what was the point? Like, at this, it was kind of like weighing, like, is this really worth it? It's like, oh, it'll slow this, but it'll create all these new problems. And my herbalist friend was like, why don't you just try reishi? And I was like, okay, let's try reishi, and somehow talked the doctor into that. And it really was very supportive, very helpful. And
Yeah.
we actually never needed these three other drugs that they suggested. Eventually, it's on other things, but it was a very strange thing. And I couldn't really find a lot of research, and I was wondering if it's going on, and I'm sure it is. And, there's more and more with mushrooms. And, I have a lot of hope for this future of, like maybe getting it more into balance where it's like, and again, not to destroy like the Western system, but to be able to recognize like, okay, what is really, another option or a different way of looking at it. And like you said, it's looking at the whole system. And I
And
think a lot of that.
there are
Yeah.
some really good herbs that we know of that have both a long traditional history, but also a lot of modern research to validate that are really good for brain health. And that would be one of the things that I would look at. What I have used actually. One is with ginkgo. There are
Mm.
really some very rigorous studies done with ginkgo, usually standardized. It's not usually just the tincture or the capsule. It's usually a standardized ginkgo extract that was used for early onset
Mm.
Alzheimer's, because ginkgo has a long history of being used for brain health. It's actually known to cross the brain-blood barrier. Rosemary is another one. It's a major anti-inflammatory, always used to stimulate memory. I take that not every day, but on regular basis as my famous brain tonic, which is rosemary, ginkgo, gotu kola, and a little bit of peppermint in there. I make it into a tincture. I usually make a quart at a time. And then I use it for maybe 3 or 4 months and stop for a couple weeks, and then take it again. And definitely when I use it, I notice a difference. I feel like my brain has been just swept clean a little bit. Some of the cobwebs are taken out of it. And then there's bacopa, which has a long history of being
Mm.
used for brain health, and gotu kola. So, and reishi was a good suggestion, but reishi isn't so much affiliated with the brain so much as it is with overall health and well-being. It's called the mushroom of immortality. So it does have it's a very powerful adaptogen. So it does have a really good place in that. But, those other herbs can all be utilized really well. There's not a lot of long-term research on Alzheimer's, except as I said, with ginkgo, and only on early onset.
Really. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I do
This was
agree with
like
you.
late. This was when she was starting to get like hallucinations, and it was,
Yeah,
it was too late to stop anything, but it was more
yeah,
like, okay, how do we
yeah.
calm down things a little bit?
And also support, just support her being. Yeah. And that's really a great way of using herbs for serious health imbalances. And, people are often so hesitant to use herbs with drugs, and,
Yeah.
for understandable reasons. And here we're talking about pharmaceuticals, again, that have really powerful, that are used for life-saving, situations. But all of my general, and I'm not, I don't want the listeners to just go out and do this. You always need to work with your healthcare practitioner, ideally someone who understands herbs and holistic treatment. But any of the tonic and adaptogen herbs that serve like really concentrated foods in the system, I never hesitate to use, actually, because their whole work is supporting the overall health of the body. They're not working so much as a medicine in the body as a super tonics and nurturers for the body. So yeah, like using reishi when people are undergoing cancer therapy, or using astragalus, is highly recommended. Anybody who has used it has found that people do better, actually, not worse.
Mhm.
So
Oh my God, beautiful. Thank you. I mean, I'm curious as a teacher and a writer, and with all the offerings you have you noticed any increase of people, let's say people who start their path with plants by taking psychedelic mushrooms, psilocybin or ayahuasca or some kind of like that plant first. And then there's something that shifts, they get in touch with the earth. They start to see plants differently. They develop a different relationship with their food. I mean, and I say we as a lot of people who have worked with, these medicines and kind of been around these ceremonial spaces for so long. I've witnessed it with people that are just kind of, your average day guy coming in who's a, corporate X or Y, and he comes in, it's like his first experience. And then because by the way, I was just talking to someone very recently about this, and he said, my wife thinks that I've changed since,
Yeah.
and since taking these medicines. And I'm like, but in a good way, right? And he's like, oh yeah, but it was, and I said, how have you changed? And he said, well, it's like I care more about the environment and the earth. And he did say, he's like, but I've always cared, but now it's a different level of it. It's like, I think it's just woven into his life more. And we have found this, I think a lot of people have noticed that these plants kind of have you feel this connection. Have you noticed this over the years, that there's this link, or just a
Well, I think
coincidence?
that I would say that herbs are a gateway drug to activism. They do connect you with and that's not my quote, actually. That's Susan Leopold, the executive director of United Plant Savers. She says that quote that, herbs, and I know you're referring to the hallucinogenic or psychedelic herbs here, but really all herbs are a gateway drug to activism, to make us be more active in the world and to be more aware and conscious. Plants do that. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about, when you were asking me about joy, like, do I think plants bring more joy? They bring they bring awareness, right? So even just, yeah, the psychedelic plants would do it very strongly because they're power medicine. But even an herb like chamomile or whatever, and you drink that every day in the evening time, or, your nettle or whatever, they start to open you up because they're about connection. You're not just drinking a tea, you're drinking some ancient being that's been growing for centuries in certain soils on certain places of the planet. They have ancestors that go back to the beginning of time. It's a really pretty powerful thing when you sit and think about that. So yeah, I do think so. And then on a bigger level, like especially with the sacred plant medicines that you're referring to, I mean, they go into our cells and they make our cells just expand, and that's why people feel they see God when they take them, because every part of you is sparkling alive and you are seeing God. And that once you've seen God and have that relationship, a sacred relationship with the Creator, it connects you to everything, which is why then people kind of get addicted to that, and then they want it again. They don't know how to bring that into every day, just how you work with that on an everyday level, so that the practice isn't so much that we're having to use these really powerful and often very rare plants. None of those plants grow in abundance anywhere. So then it allows people then to learn how to do that on your own without the crutch.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm curious, what is your hope for the future of, this world, the people, the plants, maybe where this is all going? Like, if you could imagine 20, 30 years, and, I say short-term future, do you have hopes for, this world, humanity, and our connection to the earth and plants? Or, what are your thoughts on the direction?
Well, I have high hopes, right? Because without hope, what is there? I have high hope and also because I've seen, and almost everybody I know, I can't even really think if I know any bad people. Everybody I know, and I know a lot of people, are filled with light. They're really good people. And when I travel around the world, almost every single person I've ever met has been a light being on the planet. They're just filled with light. They have troubles and they have personality quirks, and, maybe some have really rough language or whatever, but there's a light in them. So I have hope that humans can take a giant step in our evolution. That's what I always pray. We have incredible capacity, some of the most compassionate beings, and, beings that are so full of possibility for love and caring for others. Humans have this tremendous capacity to be a great force on the world, but we're not living up to that. And so my prayer every day actually is that humans will take a giant step in their evolution, or nature take care of us. Because if we don't, we're making it really bad for all the other life on this planet. And we are removing ourselves from the great web of life if we don't step up. So, and that's a hard thing, because it all begins with each one of us, like each one of us have to find that place in ourselves to step up. And that's when it gets challenging. It's always easy to blame the person on either side of you.
Yeah.
But
Oh, yeah.
or the leaders of the country, or whoever we feel like, the leaders of some other country, whoever we feel like blaming at the moment. But it really does come down, and all the great spiritual teachers have always said that it comes down to where you're standing in the circle and what you're doing to lift it up. So it's a huge responsibility we all carry. I think we are coming to that time when we are going to be required to take that giant step, and not a small step anymore. It's really a big step. We have to all be willing to lift one another up. And I think we're in practice. I think I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and the more people that open up to these plants, I mean, that's my theory. It's like the more people that are in relationship with the plants, then it's the earth, then it's, oh, okay, how can I be better? What am I doing? Turning inward, like you said, versus just pointing and blaming and, like the leader's destroying everything. I'm like, really? I don't know. Is it just one guy or two guys or five guys? It's like, there's so much more to this story. Thank you so much for sharing. Some last fun questions. Well, before we get into the fun questions, I would love to know, what are you up to in your work this year? Any new books, plans coming out? You have so much you're always up to.
I have a new book that just came out, actually, called The Generosity of Plants. And it's the book that I've had absolutely the most fun putting together. I was really a gatherer and a collector. It's called The Generosity of Plants, Shared Wisdom from the Community of Herb Lovers. And actually, I've been really probably working on this book for 50 years because it's a collection of plant musings and, botanical musings, reflections, thoughts of herbalists and plant lovers, not just herbalists, but, botanists, plant lovers, gardeners from around the world. And they're quotes or musings that I've collected over the years that had like a deep meaning. I always have loved quotes, or little lines that people say, because, one statement can just take you really deep or send you off on a little journey. So, it's just, and then my publisher, which is the same publisher I've used for many years, Storybook Publications, who I love, they just got so behind it, and they matched all the sayings with these just beautiful pictures, and these are all originals for the book. None of them were stock photos. So it was really a collective effort. I'm very happy with it. And it's, not a book. It doesn't have recipes, or it's not like any of my other very practical books. It's much more spiritual.
Oh, good.
So I
Beautiful.
did that. And then I've been rewriting my entire home study course. I first wrote my home study course in 1981, which has been quite a number of years. I've updated it a few times. I'm in the process of doing a complete update, which is a huge project. It's about 1,000 pages. It's a lot of writing. But so I've been doing that. And I have been traveling and teaching a little bit more. I was just in the Azores last week, and next week I'm going to Sweden, do a little herb class there for some Swedish herbalists. But I'm just kind of having a good time.
Wow. That's amazing that you're rewriting this home study. I'm just curious, is it like the plants haven't changed, right? So is it just,
and the information hasn't changed. It's interesting when I look back, even when I look back to the original version, the information, I'm just astounded. I wrote it when I was in my late 20s. I'm astounded by how that information just channeled into me, and how it's the same. The herbal teachings are the same, but it's new resources. I know new information. I'm a better writer than I was even when I wrote it the last time. So it's just keeping it updated. But there's a lot of new things. I love highlighting different teachers. So there's, I'm highlighting different friends who are writing like a piece on Ayurvedic medicine, so there's it'd be a lot like if I'm teaching school and I'd like to have different teachers come in. I feel like you really learn herbalism best when you study with a lot of different teachers in different ways. So you find your own way. I've always been a real advocate of that. We usually have mentors that we follow, but it's really good not to follow a mentor too closely because you can mimic that mentor and you don't want to. Herbs have their own pathway for you, just for you. So it's good to kind of get in touch with that. My kitty's here. That's who I keep reaching over and petting. She's jumping all around me.
I love it. And then thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
What about if someone, there's just kind of the person who's listening to this and is like, yeah, I really want to get into herbs more and I don't really know anything. What book do you recommend they start with, or what resource of yours?
Oh, yeah,
Like
there's
for
some
the
great
kind of
herb books.
the home person, not the
Yeah.
like full on I'm a career herbalist, but
Yeah, so I have that book I wrote called what's it called? Beginners. What is it called? It's my beginner's herbal medicine, a beginner's uh, an introduction to herbalism or something. That is my favorite book actually, and it's the one that most people start with because it's deep enough, but it's also an introduction to herbalism. And it gives you all the really good, safe, basic information and safety levels. And yeah, that's a great book. There's so many good books out there today, but my beginner's what is it? Herbal Medicine, A Beginner's Guide. That's what it's called. And it's by Story Publication. That's a really good introduction because it's not so much that it's overwhelming. Actually, to be honest, when I sent that manuscript in, it was like 3 times as long. And my publishers, yeah, they wisely though, they said, we want it to be a beginner's herbal and we don't want to overwhelm people. And they really, really worked with it to make it a much more doable book for people who are looking for an introduction to herbalism. So yeah, I trusted them and they really came out with a good book. Otherwise it's too much, so oftentimes when people are beginning, it can on anything, if you're learning guitar or something, it's good to learn a few chords before you jump into a full-on song. So yeah.
beautiful. Thanks. And we'll have links to this and your course and all your work right here in the
Thank
show
you.
notes. But the fun question, because I've asked this before, and I credit Ben Malcolm, who's also known as the spirit pharmacist, who also works in the kind of psychedelic space. If you were stuck on a deserted island and you only had one plant to choose from, what would that plant be to have
It
with
would be
you?
nettle.
It's funny because nettle. I keep talking about nettle to everybody. I'm curious, why nettle?
Well, because a lot of reasons. One is because it's incredibly rigorous. So I would not have to worry about over harvesting it. I wouldn't have to worry about it reseeding itself. It can grow in almost any condition. It's so powerful. It's an incredible food. It's just delicious. So if I could get a little fire going or whatever, I could steam nettle and I could live on it because it's high in protein, high in calcium, high in a whole spectrum of vitamins and minerals. It's also an incredible medicine. So I could also if I started to get coughs or colds or had any issues going, I could take nettle and nettle would help me. It also, it's also, let's see what else. Also, I could let it go to seed, collect the seeds, and I have an incredible source of protein, also a nice stimulant for my system. If I was a guy, I could use the root for prostate issues. I'd have no problem with my prostate. And then also I could let it go in, let it fully grow, and then I could beat the stem and I could get this incredible fiber. I could make a rope with it. I could also weave that fiber and make clothing. So yeah.
I didn't know about the fiber part. I didn't know about that.
And then, there's a beautiful, I have beautiful like scarves, purse, pillow even made from nettle fabric. Yeah. And then of course there's the spiritual teaching of nettle. Nettle is an incredibly powerful spiritual teacher. And it's highly evolved plant. Like plants who are really highly evolved that have so much food and medicine in them have to have their own protection, like roses too. So it has its little prickles. They're not thorns. They're little needles that are filled with formic acid, which by the way, that formic acid is the same acid that's in bee stings and in ant bites. And that I could use as if I get any kind of stiff joints or whatever, I could do urtication, it's called. And I could take care of my joint issues with that. Also help with if I got any allergies to the strange pollen on the island. And also nettle is just fabulously good company. Actually, some of the first and earliest conversations I had with plants were with nettles when I was in my early 20s. So all kinds of great, fun, incredibly healing, powerful things you can do with nettle.
Fun. I love it. Thank you. I remember my first encounter with nettle, believe it or not, was at I had a community garden plot in New York City that was only like, 5 feet by 5 feet, like a little square. And I was on a wait list for 4 years to get this plot. Someone gave it up. And I get on there and there's like this huge wall of nettle in the back. And I'm like, what is this? And of course I go to just grab it and like pull it out because I didn't even know. And then it's just like, oh, this is like, 20 something years ago. And I'm like, what is this horrible plant?
Yeah, I know it's me. I'll tell you
Little
one
did
of
I
my
know.
favorite nettle stories. So I grew up on a dairy farm, as I mentioned, and I had a little horse named Sparky. He was kind of a little wild horse, actually. He was wild. And I loved him, and I used to ride him a lot. And he would oftentimes throw me, and whenever he would buck me off, he'd always buck me in the nettle patch, right? Dairy farms always have big nettle patches. So I would get these terrible welts. So I always had a lot of reverence for the nettle. And then when I was in my early 20s, I was traveling to study with one of my early teachers, Norma Myers, who was an old Native woman. She lived on a small island off the coast of British Columbia, on the very furthest tip of it. So, and it was a reservation of, I forget the Native people there, but the island was the reservation that they lived on. And so a few young herbalists like myself, we would travel there to study with Norma, right? And this one time I arrived, like to get to Norma's, you had to travel by train, bus, taxi, and then a little boat that would take you to the island. You'd come up to the island and there would be like 30 different huge old totems that guarded the island. You'd come up through the mist and that. So when I arrived there, it was like late in the afternoon, getting on evening. And Norma lived in a little tiny house and her husband was a fisherman. And she always had students there like myself who would travel there, and we'd sleep on her floor, etc. So when I arrived, it was dusk and I was hungry and I definitely was not going to ask Norma for a meal. So I had noticed when I came into her house, there was a big patch of nettle by the back steps, right? So I was going to go out and collect some nettle to make dinner. And she had her gathering basket, her gloves and scissors there, so I put the gloves on, took the basket and went out to collect some nettle. And as I'm collecting, cutting off the young tops of the heads, I hear the plant, literally a voice saying to me, take your gloves off. And I look at the nettle patch. I feel like I've always communicated with plants, but usually not in English, right? It's usually just a feeling or a sense. This was a clear directive from the plant. Take your gloves off. I look at the plant and I say, no way. I hear it again. So I take my gloves off and I keep picking and my hands get all welted up and I keep picking. And then I learned the secret of the nettle. I'd always read about this. The best antidote for nettle rash is nettle juice. So as I picked and picked, the sting goes away, the welts go away, but my hands are like dancing with warmth. I felt like I had those healer hands where they're so hot. And so, yeah, and that's when I learned to pick nettle with my bare hands. I learned after that if I went up to the nettle plant, again, I'm not saying this for your listeners to do this, but if I went up to the nettle plant and I went up to it really reverently, like with a prayer in my hand and my heart, I could pick the nettle leaves just by picking them without getting stung anymore. And I've taught hundreds and hundreds of my students to do that over the years. If you don't pay attention, you start talking or get distracted, the nettle will reach down and grab you. But if you're just very thoughtful, you can pick those leaves without getting stung by them.
I'm going to try that. Thank you. I love this story. That's so sweet. I love it. It's funny because I keep bees and I have noticed over the years that I get stung less and less and less. And it's just the approach. It's like the relationship, and when they do sting, which, last year, I think I only got one, it's always an accident. It's always like they just get stuck in, a piece of clothing. And then it's like, but they're never out to get me anymore.
Yeah.
The first year, it's a different story. Aw. Well, Rosemary, it was so good to have you on here. It's just
Thank
such a
you.
joy, and I am eternally grateful for your work and being a pioneer in this plant world. And you give me a lot of hope, and I'm just so happy. So many people, and by the way, all the people I know who've studied with you are just so cool and great people, and so honored to have you here. And we'll have all your links so everybody can check out your programs. And yeah, keep on doing the great work. I love it. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Beth. It's been wonderful. A joy. I really appreciated being on with you. Thank you. And the same to you. Good luck with your work and keep following your path. It's powerful.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.